All right, hey everybody. It's Jonathan. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I'm back in Canada. I've been back for a little bit, and am in the process of getting caught up. Though, for those of you guys that were at the Game Changer Clinic back in Massachusetts, hang tight. I'm still working on stuff. I got some new tech for Christmas. Videoing to all those iPhones, which I thought was going to be a good idea at the time, has just bogged me down completely. So, videos will be coming shortly. I'm going to try to adjust my settings here as we go and see if I can't change some things. Get my saturation down here a little bit so I don't look like I'm so tan because I live in Canada. So, that's a little bit better. It's a little more realistic. All right, so listen, I wanted to put this video out. I've had like 4 videos in the pipeline to start the year. I had these great plans to start like with some good, kind of rehash some principles. It's funny. This last year for me has been interesting because there's certain things about lacrosse that excite me. There's certain things about lacrosse that bug me, and I tend to hesitate. And so, but then on Monday night, this past week on Monday Night Football, there was an event where Damar Hamlin of the Buffalo Bills made a tackle, basically got a shoulder to the chest, made the tackle. Everything looked okay. He stood up a couple seconds later and he collapsed and he was resuscitated twice. So, um, so for all intents and purposes, kind of the initial thought of this is that it's a Commotio Cordis event. I will come right out and say right now, I don't believe it was a Commotio Cordis event. I know I have posted about it in the group as it is as a Commotio, like in that context, because I know that's what every lacrosse goalie parent is thinking right now. And to be honest, people are kind of freaking out a little bit, which is to be expected, right? Completely warranted and completely expected. Okay. Um, and so I want to start with that. And don't forget, I'm a dad. Okay. I'm a parent. I have a son who plays rugby. How the hell that happened, I have no idea. Uh, but I've coached a ton of goalies. When I was in high school, just to share with you, when I was in high school, I went to the Syracuse lacrosse camp, and at the Hobart camp that was happening at the same week, a goalie died of commotio cordis. He'd gotten hit in the side around the chest protector, um, and um, and that's when I first knew about commotio cordis. I had no idea. Okay, so this might be a little bit of a long video and one that you might want to um, save. I'll put. You know what? I'll even post this to YouTube so that you can share this with other parents and other groups and whatnot, and to get out my take on this. Because one, uh, like I said, every parent has a right to be concerned. Okay, and this is going to be a long video, right? It's like super late, and I was going to go to bed, but I was like, nah, I got to do this video now because I know there's a lot of people thinking about this. Okay, so here's the deal. Um, Understand that as a parent, you're going to have a concern for your kid, and like any parent would. However, that amongst parents, there's going to be a scale of concern. Okay, I heard a great interview on ESPN uh, today. Is by a professional football player. I have some friends that work at ESPN, so this was kind of cool. Uh, but this player, this talking head, was basically saying like no athlete thinks of dying, okay, when they play their sport, which is true, right? I've had some pretty unique experiences in sport where I've been around athletes who have died. All right. For those of you guys that have known me long enough, like in 2010, I worked for the broadcaster for the Vancouver Olympics in 2010 in Vancouver, and we had an athlete uh, fly out of the track, hit a metal pole, and basically his aorta separated from his heart, and he died instantly. But it didn't feel instantly. And at that time, I feel the same thing that a lot of you guys are feeling right now, which is like, and we see some of this, you're like, oh, sport's not worth that, right? It's not worth dying for, and I would totally agree with that, right? But just know this: that athletes and I'm going to share something in a moment here that's going to be very offensive to a lot of people, but it's worth sharing. It's this idea that athletes never think about these things. They think about competing, they think about pushing envelopes, they think about finding their limits. But the same day that this event happens, there was a guy by the name of Ken Brock, who's 55 years old, who's a popular. He's a YouTuber. He's a rally car racer. He does these amazing videos. If you just Google like Ken Brock Vegas Audi Hoonigan, it's Hoonigan. Go watch what he did. And he died in a snowmobiling accident where they're out in the woods. The snowmobile falls on him, and he dies. Earlier this year, okay, there was a hockey player by the name of Evander Kane who had his wrist skated over by a hockey skate, and without some quick work by the opposing team's medical team, because they were the closest to the bench. He was the closest to that bench. He almost died by a skate blade. There's a very famous story, like back in like 1971, of a football player. I think it was for Chicago, or they were playing at Chicago, but he just collapsed. In the sport of cycling, in doping, what a lot of people have forgotten is that in the world of doping, there's doping like, you take a drug and that's doping, but actually doping started out like for years. Cyclists would take cocoa leaves, which is, they would take cocaine, they would take drugs, performance enhancing drugs to complete. They would also like take their blood. They would basically like you would donate blood, and your blood goes in a bag, and they would put it in a centrifuge, and they'd suck out all the red blood cells and then put that back into the cyclist. So the blood was like sludge, and cyclists were dying of heart attacks because the heart couldn't deal with that level of viscosity, right? So, but then also along the way, some of you might remember, uh, I think back in like the 80s, and the name of the athlete totally escapes me right now, but the Celtics, I think they had drafted like the #1 draft pick that year, and he dropped dead of a thing called Marfan's syndrome. And that was the first time I'd ever seen or heard that happen. And Boston, being the sports town it is, I just remember just going to school and everybody was just kind of bummed out. But then it came back like, oh, it was like, black guys got it, white guys didn't get it. People with long arms compared to their torso got it, all that sort of stuff. So right now, what I want you to understand is that while this looks like a Commotio Cordis event, and Commotio Cordis is very close to the field lacrosse goalie community, you got to understand first what that is. Okay, so Commotio Cordis is a timing issue. It's when the chest is struck in the it's called the repolarization phase, or the T wave, right? Where the heart is basically, it's like a recharge, between beats, and it's this microsecond, it's we're talking milliseconds of time, where there's this window of opportunity where the heart can get struck, and it's very, from what I understand about it, and those of you may know different, and that's fine, but what I understand about it, and don't forget, I've been hearing about this for 25 plus years now, is that the type of contact is very specific and independent. In that football game Monday night, there's probably 100 hits, where there was guys getting hit like of equal force, but just from different angles, and different timing. For Damar Hamlin, like, had that hit happen like a couple microseconds prior to or after, he may still be walking, or he may have a condition that is unknown to the medical staff, right? My wife, for years, went undiagnosed with a what's called mitral valve prolapse, or a regurgitation, where basically the valves and the mitral valves in the heart don't one was not closing all the way, so there's like this regurgitation of blood. It's just this little pooling of blood in the ventricle, where and she had a doctor say, like, you should never work out ever again in your life. And right now, I'll tell you, like, she's 51 years old. She looks amazing. She works out all the time. but she didn't know up until someone said, "Hey, you got an issue," and then it caused a lot of fear for her. And so I share these stories with you just to kind of give you a little bit of context, and I want you to understand too. With Commotio cordis, it's very it can happen to anybody, okay, and it can happen at any time. And there's a great. I was working on a TikTok video. There's a guy on TikTok. He's a firefighter, and he just did a great video about this. And I'm going to duet it, and I'll get it out to you guys. But the idea is that Commotio cordis, um, it happens mostly in boys around the ages of 12 to 14. Okay. And I posted the other day the Akampora Foundation, which is out of Long Island. There was a young boy who died many years ago now in Long Island. He got struck in the chest. This also happens in hockey. There was a defenseman at Cornell back in like the early 2000s, and that was really when that happened. That was the push for heart guards on chest protectors for defensemen and goalies and things like that. But I'll tell you, and this I've never really shared this publicly, but for those of us kind of in and around the sport who kind of know, and this is going to piss off a lot of parents right now, but the whole idea of like the chest protectors for a lot of us, it's kind of window dressing, right? It's kind of window dressing. And what made me like upset about the chest protector, the heart guards, is then they went on pads. They made a rule saying that, well, you have to wear those chest protectors. And my take is that there's other issues of protecting a goalie that affect performance and trauma and things like that. It's not just about the heart, right? We're not wearing that chest protector just for the heart. We're wearing that chest protector to protect the athlete, to make them feel confident, and you give them courage in the cage. All right. So it's important to understand kind of all that framework, and I jumped on the protection issue, but I'll get back to that in a second. But one thing I want to tell you, and don't forget, so as much as I love my field lacrosse goalies, and you guys are like my lacrosse family, and I try really hard to share like a different side of this position in this sport than you might get from some college kid or some older coach who's just like, oh, goalies shouldn't be wearing chest protectors. I grew up, I played. There's still coaches like this, by the way. There's still coaches that think that goalies shouldn't wear chest protectors at all because it slows them down. And I think that's the biggest bunch of bullshit ever, right? And I hope all those coaches now, who would even blink to say that, basically shut the hell up. All right. Um, but the thing here is that I will add this right now, that as a parent, right, we watch the kids on the field, and we, everybody's like, oh, kids should have fun, sports should be fun. But no, sport has a competitive nature to it. And I wrote about this in my book, in An Athlete's Guide to Winning in Sports and Life. I'm like, at some point there was two cavemen sitting around a fire, and there was like one last like Fred Flintstone rib on the fire, and one caveman looked at the other caveman and said, first one to the fire gets the rib, right? And I picture like the loser like dusting embers off his tunic, that sort of thing. We're competitive people, and athletes are a competitive bunch. And one of the things that your athletes have fallen in love with is the sport, the challenge, uh, the, the dopamine rush that comes from achievement and working towards a goal and all that stuff, which I've written about, and I want to do more of this year. Like, and don't forget, I coach a lot of athletes in other sports on mental performance and high performance, things like that. So I come at this with a very different, I want to say like a more holistic mindset, because I understand where athletes are from, but I also understand from a parent perspective where sometimes you look at your athlete and you have more fear than they do. And that's something, part of being an adult. It's like, like my son's 17 years old. He went out tonight. He took the car. He probably went to Tim Hortons, got himself like a coffee and a farmer's wrap. But, I worry, right? He's driving. Didn't ask for the car, by the way. It's the first time he's done that. Got to kill him. But one of the things that every parent has to have is faith. And I've told parents, some parents that I've worked with, that if they are nervous about their athlete, if they purely think that their kid is going to have the same experience that the parent is imagining. In my opinion, with all due respect, that's bad parenting. You have to understand that your athlete has been gifted, and I use the word gift on purpose. They've been gifted with a love of this position, okay? And a parent who is overly concerned and anxious and nervous and fearful, that that is picked up on by your kids, okay, by your athlete. And so I have given advice to parents this happens in a couple sports, right? I'll share with you one that none of you, well, some of you would, but I worked with an athlete years ago who was an equestrian, right? So and it was and in the sport of equestrian, there's eventing, and eventing is like basically like a marathon on horseback. It's a rider and a horse, and they take off and they go for like tons of kilometers, and they actually had to shorten the event for the Olympics because it was just too long for TV. But it's like, the horse goes out forever. And the thing in eventing is that the bigger and stronger the horse you have, the faster you will go. However, your rider may not be prepared to ride that horse. And there's a thing that happens in eventing called spiraling, where a horse can go over like a hedge or a jump or something like that, and basically it's ass over tea kettle. Like the back end of the horse goes over the rider, and then the horse falls onto the rider, and usually that results in a pretty traumatic injury for the rider, and typically in death. And if you Google that, if you're kind of sadistic, you want to learn more information about it, just Google like spiraling in equestrian and death rates and things like that, and you'll see some pretty crazy statistics. And I believe, although it's hard to kind of cross compare, there's probably more frequency of spiraling and tragic events in equestrian than there is in of like Commotio, Cordis, and field lacrosse. Okay, so what I want, and like I started this video by saying that if you're concerned, you have every right to be concerned. However, and I can't remember who the dad was, but they commented like, I'm a proponent of protection for goalies, like, and I'm a proponent of protection for goalies. And this is where, you know, I can't give you a perfect answer here, but I look at protection as a tool. And I've said this for years, that chest protection for field lacrosse goalies, even with that stupid little chest thing they put on there to get everybody to buy new chest guards and put an Oxy logo on it and say, oh, you got to buy a new one every couple of years because yours is going to be uncertified, all that BS. I do believe that field lacrosse goalies are underprotected. However, what happens after these events is there's a subsection of parents who go like, well, shouldn't I do everything I can for my kid? Sure. However, when I worked at the Vancouver Olympics and Nodar, the athlete from Georgia, died a very tragic death, I was interviewed by the New York Times, and I said to Jonathan Abrams, who was the reporter, I said, we can't wrap all of our athletes in cotton balls and send them down because we wouldn't really enjoy that much. We can't protect for everything. And that firefighter on TikTok, and I wish I could remember his name right now, but he's hilarious. He's bald like me, and he's big and smiley, and he's got a hilarious channel. But he's like, that event that we all saw on Monday night he goes, that wasn't a football thing. He goes, he's seen it happen in karate, in ice hockey, in baseball. He goes, it's a life thing. And that is something, as parents, we all know that we can't protect our kids against everything, right? You can't lock them in your room and just say, you're not doing that again. But one thing that will come of this, all right, for your athlete, if they're aware, and for you as a parent, is an uncovering of values that you may not have known you had, right? And what happens is I did a video a number of years ago, and I think I uploaded it to my wrong YouTube channel. I'll try to find that. But I wrote about it in my book too. So if you have my book, you can go in there. It talks about when values and performance collide. If you don't have my book, please get a copy. I would love that. But I talk about when values and performance collide. And I talk about it actually in the context of performance enhancing drugs for some athletes in sports. Like, let's say your kid loves cycling and they want to be in the Tour de France. Well, you know what? There's probably, or they want to be an Olympic weightlifter. You know what? There's a point where for them to reach the ultimate goal of medaling or, you know, competing on the world stage, they might have to do drugs. And people get shocked that I even say that. But I'm not going to stick my head in the sand and tell you that, in some of those sports, that's something that, to reach the ultimate peak, you may have to do. Even in sports you might not think of. Like we had the figure skating doping issue in the last Olympics with the Russian girl. And um, yeah. So anyway, my point is that this event that just happened, and it reminded everybody like, wow, somebody can die playing a sport. Um, that's now a value identifier for you, going like, well, wait a second, it's not worth it, right? And athletes have that happen at all sorts of stages. I had an athlete, I got a phone call or got a Facebook message from a dad that I've known for years, whose daughter was just about, probably this was her year to start at a Division I school. But the last 3 years have been so abusive for her physically in the cage, literally like concussions in practice and getting beat up in practice, that she was like, you know what? Pardon me. She's like, fuck it, I'm done. It's not worth it. That's a value thing, and that's where life goes on and you start to go like, okay, wait a second. So you may or may not go through that right now. For some of the parents I've talked to, like this is no big deal to them. No risk, no what, no, no big deal. Concern, yes, for sure. Are they worried? A little. Do they think it's going to happen? They go, no. And every athlete doesn't think that's going to happen, but it might, right? But also, you might drive to the mall tonight in your car and get T-boned by a bus, right? Last year, a couple of years ago now, actually, there's a hockey team up in Saskatchewan near where I live, and it was called the Humboldt Broncos. And these boys were on their team bus going to a game, and a driver driving a big truck, yeah, a big like gravel truck, went through a stop sign on a rural road, and just there was like a hill, couldn't see the bus coming, T-boned this bus, and like a whole bunch of kids died. A whole bunch of kids were paralyzed. Hockey careers finished. Whatever, on a bus ride. Okay, so in any sporting endeavor, there is a level of faith that you have to have. There's a level of, you know what, he's happy, she's happy, she's doing what she loves, he's doing what he loves, and it's, and sometimes bad shit happens, and you can't prepare for all of it. Okay. Now, for my lacrosse families, because I have a feeling when I post this, I'll probably post this on a couple different. I'll post this on 2 YouTube channels, and so some of you might not be lacrosse families, but you're listening to me talk about Commotio, Cordis, and Damar Hamlin, and football and karate and blows to the chest and all this stuff. But really, what it is it's life. Okay, in any sport on any given day, something tragic can happen, and it's not just a high ankle sprain, right? Uh, I can think of, and those of you guys that are my age demographic, you can go back and think of athletes, all sorts of athletes that have had issues, right? Freakish events that all of a sudden, heat stroke, um, broken necks, paralyzations, kids just dropping, for randomness, random things, and then they find out, hey, they've got a heart condition. Um, and that's where athletes will all of a sudden go like, wait a second, it's not worth going on anymore. And so right now, some of you are going through this process after seeing Damar Hamlin go down and going like, is it worth that risk? Even if I feel healthy, right? I know a lot of athletes that have gone through that. I had an athlete a couple of years ago who was in my athlete OS program, um, and all of a sudden got diagnosed with something weird. I can't remember what it was. It was like a blood clot, right? Yeah, it was a blood clot, and the doctors were like, you shouldn't be competing. You shouldn't be like stressing your heart too much because it can. Now that may or may not be good advice, right? But it's like, well, do you want to risk it? And there's a subsection of athletes that do, right? There's a subsection of athletes that are able to push themselves in such a way that they are able to literally disconnect their brain from their body and say, like, I'm just going to send it, you know. And it can happen in lacrosse, it can happen in hockey, it can happen in like jumping out of a plane in a wingsuit, like go on Instagram and on TikTok and find some Red Bull videos and see those guys. This is where, from a parent's perspective, you look at that and go, oh my God, I could never do that. And what I want you to understand is what that comes out as mostly those guys are crazy. And I will tell you this from my lacrosse families and my goalie families, like if you are sitting on the sidelines and after the game you come up to your athlete and they just had a good game and you're going like, oh my God, I can't believe you do that. I can't believe you're my son or my daughter. I would never get in the cage. You know what? All you're doing is talking about you and your fears and your lack of ability in the sport. But your kid, and this is what's so weird, is that your kid is an athlete who has been gifted with a talent that you don't understand. And that's why they keep playing and they say, Dad, I don't need shin guards, right? Or Mom, I don't want to wear elbow pads, right? They are thinking about all sorts of other things and processing things that you don't understand. And even I've dealt with parents who were field goalies or ice hockey goalies, or they played hockey and their kid plays hockey, or they were gymnasts and their daughter's a gymnast. But even still then, the experience is not the same. And the mistake that parents make is thinking that their fears have to be what their athlete is feeling. And that, again, I'll say it again, I think that's bad parenting. But it's hard to disconnect yourself and say, my athlete is going to have a different experience in this world than I will, right? And that's really hard to digest, okay? And that's really hard to look at introspectively and go like, am I doing that? And there's some of you listening to me right now who know, yes, you do, right? You sit in the stands and you cringe every time a shot's taken or every hit to the body. You're like, oh my God, is he okay? Is she okay? Like, are you okay? You got to let that go. And that is one of the hardest things that a sports parent can do. All right. Because, and I'll share with you this, I want to leave with this one a little bit. I'll go quick on it. But so in one of the top 5 psychological traits is agreeableness, right? And most families that I run into are agreeable people. Someone is very agreeable, and goalies in particular, who tend to be a little bit more introverted. They migrate to the crease. Doesn't matter if it's hockey, lacrosse, soccer, field hockey, you name it. They tend to be more of an introverted, agreeable behavior. They tend to be receivers, right? Like, you're stopping things, you're catching things. They're not the ones like sticking their nose in everything. Okay. So to someone who's agreeable, the act of being disagreeable feels really shitty. Okay. But there's psychological, there's research that shows that there's a correlation between disagreeable ability and income and wealth, and people who are politicians and lawyers tend to be more comfortable with being disagreeable. But part of being agreeable, and moms, hear me out, a lot of the moms out there don't like any sort of trauma to their baby. Okay. Dads, on the other hand, are, if you think across cultures and across like the animal kingdom, the dad is the one who's like roughing up the little cubs, teaching them how to play fight before they go out and teach them how to hunt. And in most, um, animal kingdoms, the moms are home hoping everybody's okay and everybody comes home for dinner. Right. So when the moms see their little one out there, and I don't care how old you are, but that little one is always going to be your little one. You hate to see anything bad happen, and for Damar Hamlin, you just know that his family, his mom especially, is going like, not my baby, right? Not my baby. But I'll tell you this: the men, and when you listen to interviews with men about this topic, because football is played by men primarily, right now, the story, what you're hearing is about hey, this is bigger than the game. This is a human being. None of us think about playing and losing a life, right? And especially in football and on other sports too, coaches get in the huddle and they're like, all right, listen, guys, we're gonna go out there and we're gonna whoop their ass. We're gonna hurt them. We're gonna knock them out of the game. We That's all hyperbole. Nobody says like, oh, they might even say like, we're gonna kill them, but nobody really thinks that they're gonna kill somebody. But hey, that happened, right? Um, but athletes, there's a way to shut that off, right? When I was at Vancouver and Nodar died, and in this, he fell right at the feet of the head medical personnel at the Whistler, at the Illusion bobsled run there, and also the medical tent, like the trailer was right there. So there's like 50 medical volunteers in blue jackets like right there. So you can imagine just all this like kind of chaos, and there's blood running down the street, and there's like bringing up an ambulance, and there's coaches, and I was like the eyes between the sport and the world. So all the officials there knew who I was, the medical staff knew who I was, all the coaches knew who I was. I've got a producer in my ear going like, hey, we need reaction video. We need reaction. And so I'm looking for people, and I'm telling the camera guy, Jane, the only female on the camera crew, hey, like, over, and I'm pointing like, Jane, over there, over there, over there. We're trying to do our job, and things are moving on. And I get this tap on my shoulder, and it's the German coach, Norbert Locke, and his son Felix was the Olympic favorite, and he was next. He was the next sled coming down for training. And Norbert was like, John, what's the problem? Why are we waiting? And at the time, none of us knew that Nodar actually died, except for a handful of medical staff. But it just tells you like that in the scheme of all this, there's going to be different reactions, right? There's going to be different reactions and different comfort with the different values. So for a lot of my parents right now that are posting on in the group going like, oh, can we put on like more protection on our kid? And it's not, you could, but again, from a Commotio Cordis standpoint, it's timing, and it's rare. And for older athletes, it's even rare. So in terms of Damar Hamlin, I don't believe this is really a Commotio Cordis thing. I believe they'll run some tests and they may find something else, or it was just unlucky. Because, and I'm not going to speculate any further than that because I don't like doing that. But just for those of you that have athletes in position, like goalies, like lacrosse, all my lacrosse goalies out there, the protection you have on is fine. Will more protection help? I don't necessarily. What I understand about Commotio Cordis is that you may be able to dissipate the force, but again, if you have a young athlete and versus an older athlete, a stronger athlete versus a slighter athlete, there's so many variables that even if the timing is such that you just don't know. I do believe that there's better chest protectors out there in the sports world than what our field lacrosse goalies wear. I don't like how chest protectors are worn in field lacrosse. They're typically worn tight to the chest, whereas like an ice hockey goalie, that chest pad is like riding in, and it's wide enough where you can like pull your arms together, and you've got this jersey on. You pull your arms together, and that chest protector comes off the chest. It's not sitting on the chest, and I think that's really important. I think that's something that's completely lost in field lacrosse. So I will say this: I think the protection we have for field lacrosse, and I'm getting more vocal about this, the protection we have for field lacrosse goalies is stupid. It's just the whole. I don't like it. If I can scare a bunch of kids with tennis balls from 15 yards, what do you think that lacrosse ball is doing, right? So, but I just want, for those of you guys that are worried about your goalie, I'm going to tell you, please don't worry. And I know it's really hard to, it's easy to say, harder to do, but I don't want you to be walking around with fear every time your kid goes to practice, because that will affect their performance, right? And I don't think that will attract like Commotio Cordis in their life. But if every day you're watching and you're like, oh, your inside fear shouldn't be your outside voice, because your fears are not your goalie's fears. I can guarantee it. And if your goalie comes to you and says, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, I don't want to do that, I want to go play attack, go for it. Go for it. Go for it. Or if they say, hey, I want to play defense instead. Well, okay. But yeah, there was that Cornell kid who died of Commotio Cordis a bunch of years ago. But if your athlete is like 15, 16, 17, you're out of that window where Commotio Cordis is a concern. It's going to get rarer and rarer and rarer. And so it's just important to understand kind of what's going on. So I hope this helps. Like, for those of you guys that have listened, and for all my my goalies that are listening, listen. Only if you're in the cage, and we worked on this at our Game Changer clinic, where I take the stick away and I have kids get in the cage, and because one of my challenges to my goalies is, if you can't get in front of a ball without your stick, then that stick has become not a tool to make saves, but a tool. It's a protective tool, because you're not comfortable taking that off the chest. Whereas if you look at baseball catchers, they will train to take balls out of the dirt into their chest. They will ice hockey goalies, same thing. I believe pennies are really have retarded the development of field lacrosse goalies. Nobody's really talking about that, but we can talk about that another day. So anyway, I love all of you. I love your goalies. I don't want you to have fear on a daily basis, but just think of this event as like it's just a value touch, right? What do you value? What does your goalie value, right? I would ask your goalie once, hey, how you feeling? Do you want to, if you want to get a padded shirt underneath it, go for it. If you want to buy some extra like hex padding and glue it on the other, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying no to any of that, but I am saying no to the concept that as a parent, you can't wrap your kid up in cotton balls and think you're going to take away all the risk. You just can't. All right. But I will say this, and I'll try to end more and more videos with this concept. As parents, we need to be fighting for better protection for field lacrosse goalies. I think it's stupid. I really think it's just silly. When I look at other sports and I work with other athletes in other sports, and I come back to this and I go like, really? We shouldn't be having that fear. So anyway, love all of you. Do me a favor. Wherever you're seeing this, on YouTube, on my athlete specific channel, my athlete OS channel, my lacrosse channel, wherever, leave a comment. Leave a well thought out comment, okay? And we can continue the discussion. And yes, there'll be some of you going like, well, I should do everything I can for my kid. Sure. Yes. But I think one of the worst things you can do for your athlete is to put fear in their head that's not there. And that's something that's really hard for a parent to understand, that your kid doesn't have the same fears that you do. And that doesn't mean that, hey, I'm the adult and they don't know what the hell they're doing yet, and I know better. You know what? I've done this a long time. If you've got a disconnect, or you're trying to connect like your sports experience to what they're doing, it's different. It's different. And I'll just leave you with that. Like, your inside fears shouldn't be your outside voice, because your goalie, you don't want to track that stuff, and you want to give your goalie, allow your goalie to have the courage that they have. And I'll tell you this, a more courageous goalie is in a better position to not get hurt than one who's in the cage who's fearful because mom or dad put fear in their head. So I know it's kind of tough to say, but it's true. So anyway, I love you all. Okay, don't stress. Be positive. Leave a comment. See you soon.